So let's have a look at a bit of sort of basic, very basic layout in CSS. So far we've got our basic kind of navigation working. We've got a CSS file loaded. Here I've modified the background color just so it's just like a warm off-white at the moment. We can change that, of course, to whatever we want later, if that suits us. But let's have a look at it as we've got it. As things stand, this isn't really much of a layout at all. It is highly accessible, which is a very positive thing. But in terms of graphic design, not brilliant. So navigation at the top, we've got a couple of headings. The first one here, of course, is an H1 heading. This one's an H2. Remember that you can only have, or you should only have, you must only have exactly one H1 heading on a page. Okay. So the problems here are not technical. They are not simply aesthetic either. They are practical. So I've mentioned quite a few times the importance of making sure that websites remain accessible as you build them out. But one issue you have with the sort of default styling in a browser is that it's not great for most users. Okay, if you'll have a look at this, if I pull out the web browser so it's fairly wide on my screen here, we wind up with these tremendously long lines of text. Now, for most people, you're probably going to find, if you look at this, if you read along here, you're probably going to find that you're going to start to get a little bit fed up with reading a single line of text around about this sort of mark. And that is pretty consistent for everyone. The rule of thumb, good rule of thumb, is about 80 characters maximum for a line of text. In English, that works out to about 10 to 12 words. In some other languages, with such languages like German, it's going to be fewer words. And there might be others where it's more words, but it's around about 80 characters is about right as a maximum. Now, you don't want your lines of text to be too short either, generally, at least if you're reading for any sort of length. Maybe for something like a caption or a sidebar, it might be okay. Okay, so let's have a look at this. I mean, one solution is just to say to people, just make your browser window narrower, okay? And so for a small screen such as a phone, that's not bad at all, actually. But while we want to be designing for phones first, simply because the majority of your site visitors will be using phones, it's not really adequate as a solution for everyone. So we need to bring in some level of layout into here. Okay. And subsequently, we'll get back into having a look at things like bringing some refinement, further refinement to our typography, and especially to making sure that there's a good hierarchy on the page. Now, there is a hierarchy here between the H1, H2 tags, and if there were any H3, H4, H5. That is a hierarchy already, but it's a semantic hierarchy rather than being so much a visual one. And we do want to make sure that the site is well designed visually as well. So I'm just going to actually park that window over here on the right and come back to Visual Studio Code. All right. So we've got our HTML here, and what I've done is that I've got my content, which you can see over here in the web browser. I've got my content down here within a section, inside a section element. Now, I could also use another element, would also work, which would be something like article. Not article. And I just need to make sure that the closing tag is correct as well. That's also a pretty good choice if it is in fact something like an article, but I'll leave it as section for the time being, because that does make sense, and there might be other sections on the page as well later on. And I've given it a class attribute and a CSS class that this is one that I've made up, just called content-main, which I will define in my CSS file here. All right. We will also look at styling the navigation a little bit more as well. Okay, and we've of course got the nav-primary class assigned to this. Now, that class doesn't actually exist yet in my CSS file, but it will. All right, so let's have a look at our CSS file. All right, in here, it's just a quick reminder, you want to always put this line at the top of your CSS file. Just to mention that again, or these 3 lines, you want that little asterisk there, that star. That means that it's going to apply this formatting to every element and every class on your page. And it's going to use border box sizing for the boxes. So what that means is that when you assign a width to an element or a class, we're going to be assigning a width to the content class down here, content-main class down here. When you give it, if you give it some padding, that padding does not make that wider than the width that you specify. All right, so this is a much better way to work, and it makes a lot more sense for us as designers, frankly, as well. And we don't have to do the calculation. All right, so I'm going to give this, again, this is the class that can, for the section, I've applied to the section element that contains all of that text there. So I'm going to give it a width of 80%. All right, so let's see what that does. Let's come back here and refresh it. Command R, reload. All right, it's a little better, still not great. A little better, but it's definitely still, when the browser window is wide, still getting too wide. Okay, so that's not really much of a solution so far. So we do want to, most of the time, generally speaking, it's good to err on the side of using fluid units such as percentages for things like width. That's because the web, as you can see, is a fluid medium. It's very different from designing for print. If you're designing a brochure or a book or a poster, you have an absolute fixed width when you're designing for print. Yeah, the same is true of signage, of course, but the web just is that fluid kind of medium. It's part of what's great about it, but when you're designing for it, it takes a little while to get your head around that at first. Okay, so I mentioned before that we want to make sure that our line width is no wider than 80 characters. Well, happily, we have another unit that we can use. I could specify the width as exactly, say, 80 ch, 4 characters. There are lots of different units in CSS, cascading style sheets, but the character unit is particularly useful in this situation, so ch for character. Okay, so it's going to give it a fixed width of 80 characters. All right, so that seems pretty good. The lines are definitely, the measure is definitely much better. The measure, as we say, meaning the line length. There are lots of other problems with the typography as it stands, but at least our measure is good. The only drawback with this is that, as you can see here on a small screen, that's going to be too wide. And we've actually got a bit of horizontal scrolling down here, a bit of a scroll bar appearing down there. That's horrible, isn't it? Generally you don't want to be scrolling horizontally. There are uses for it, but not for a whole page as a rule. Okay, so the percentage value is better, it's more fluid. So what do we do? It's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? Happily, there is this property, the max width property. There's also a min width property, but max width is probably the more useful of the two. So max width, and guess what? We can set this to 80 ch. Okay, so that will mean that on a smaller screen, okay, it's not going to go any wider than 80 characters, and we just use the percentage for that smaller screen. Okay, now when we get into looking at responsive design, making our website layouts respond to the size of the window or the viewport, then we will actually be able to adjust that width as well. Okay, so this is looking a little bit better. Now, what I would like to do, because I'm just wanting to set up a very simple layout, is just to center this text, that whole block. I don't mean center align it. I want to keep it left aligned, but take that whole block and put it in the middle of the page. All right, so you might think that something like, there would be something like an align property, or you might notice that there's text align and you might choose center. Unfortunately, that will actually just center the text, and what's more, doesn't do anything for the layout. Okay, so that's not what we want. We don't have to specify a text alignment, we just want it ragged right here, or left aligned, whichever term you want to use. So the solution is a little bit counterintuitive. It is in fact using the margin property. So margin is the spacing outside the box that we're looking at, if you think of the CSS box model. And I'm going to use the shorthand syntax here rather than margin top, left, bottom, right. So I'm just going to put that in. The way that this works is that you specify the margin starting at the top, then the right, then the bottom, then the left. So you just put them all kind of clockwise going around the box there. Now I will actually just quickly put a background color just on that content dash main element, just so you can see it. You can see where it is, forming that sort of a box there. So I've just given that yellow background there, just with the background property. Okay, so I want to put in a margin. I might give it a little bit of space at the top. I'm going to use the rem unit, more on that later, especially as we start to dig more into typography. So that's the top. All right, we need the right margin and the left margin. Okay, so the right margin now, this is where the trick comes in. Give it a margin value of auto. So it's going to be auto on the right hand side there. Now because the width is being controlled by these that width line and the max width line, that means that when we come around to the bottom, let's put another value there, 1 rem will do for now. I'm going to put the left margin as auto as well. So it's top, right, bottom, left, going clockwise around that box. All right, so watch what happens when I reload this now with the Command R. Okay, boom, there we go. It's nicely sort of positioned in the middle of that page. Okay, as we resize that, it's sort of behaving reasonably nicely. Okay, except for that somewhat garish yellow background. We also don't have any padding on that, so it's looking a bit cramped. So I will just, I'm just going to delete that background color there now. All right, so that's a little bit of super basic layout there. Now, I promised you that I would also style the navigation a little bit. Okay, so coming back to our HTML, we've assigned it a class called nav-primary, which doesn't yet exist. So I'm just going to actually just copy that class name from here. Notice again, just a little reminder, when we put a class name into our HTML here, we do not use a full stop, but we do use one when we're defining a CSS class in our CSS file. Here we are in styles.css. So I put a little full stop there. Command V, paste in that class name. And this time I'm also going to give it a width of 80%. I'm not going to bother with a max width value. And I will also give it a margin value. I'm going to do the same kind of thing. I'll give it a little bit of space at the top, 1 rem. So that's the top value, again going clockwise around the box. Margin on the right of auto, margin at the bottom, we'll set that to 0 because we've got a bit of space on the content main here. Could do it either way. Actually, I changed my mind. I will set the top margin on the content one to 0, and I'll set the margin underneath the navigation to 2 rem. I will come back and explain that rem unit in a moment. Okay. So that will position the navigation area in the middle, but it won't yet center that text. So we want these things kind of nicely centered there as well. Now, there are lots and lots of different ways for making a navigation bar. We will be looking at more elaborate ones, as I say, using lists later on. For now, I'm just going to use text-align center, just to sort of center those navigation links within the actual box itself. Okay, so let's reload this. Okay, that's all right, isn't it? Whoops. So we've got navigation there, and we've got some content here. So things are shaping up. So I might actually just put a little bit of a border at the bottom of the. I put it at the bottom of the navigation. Possibly, I could put a border. I could put a background color. So I might actually set its width to 100%. Give it a background. I might just copy and paste this color value down here, the RGB color value. And I'm going to use this little color picker here, just sort of, oh, isn't working. All right, let's make that just a little bit brighter. I'm actually going to set that to 255, so we'll get actually a pure white there. Give it a top margin of 0. Maybe a little bit of padding. So I'm going to give it a little bit of padding just to let it, see if I can let it breathe a little bit. We might need a little bit more here. Let's see how that looks. It's a bit subtle. Anyway, it's starting to work. All right, so there are other things we can do here to style it. We can style the actual links themselves, maybe to remove that underline underneath them. And of course, we'll be putting in some nicer typefaces, but more on that next time.